So now that we have gotten down the basics of frames, we're going to dive in and look at the different frame attributes, as well as practice planning out and coding our own frames by hand before we jump in and start coding them in Notepad++. As a result, your 2 learning targets by the end of this lesson are that you'll be able to describe the various attributes of the frame tag. So we'll really look at our options there as we code those frames, and then that we can plan and create frames for displaying different web pages by using the frame set and the frame tags together. So over the next few pages, you'll be seeing some different frame attributes, and I'd like you to either add these into your attributes handout, so if you want to grab more of those out of the bin, that'd be fine, or you can just tack them on to your previous page of your notes where you wrote down all of those different attributes. So what you're going to notice about some of these is they're actually a review of what we've seen before, but they just work a little bit differently in our frame tag. So the first one we have is source. This is similar to the source that we had when we used our image tag. And what this does is it indicates the web page or file, so notice you could have something like a picture or something, that is going to be displayed in that frame. And this is essentially displayed in that frame at the start. So when that frame definition file is loaded, what should be displayed? This is needed for each frame, otherwise nothing will be displayed in that particular frame. So the source picks the web page or file to be displayed when that frame definition file is first loaded. Then from there we also give each frame a name, and I'm going to state that each frame needs its own name as well. And the reason it needs a name is so that it can be used as a target, and we want it to be used as a target so that we can change what is being displayed. So if we ever want to change it, then you need to give that frame and give every frame a name to make it uniquely identifiable. Now the third attribute that's typically used with frames is the title attribute, and what it does is it indicates the frame's purpose. Now most of the time this is the same as the frame's name, and really the big deal with this one is that this one doesn't act as a target. This one essentially allows people with non-visual browsers, maybe people with disabilities, it allows them to utilize your website and makes it more accessible. So this isn't really going to be super required for my class, but if you were to use frames in a future career, you would want to have a title in there so that it really identifies the purpose of that particular frame. Then next we have our frame border, so similar to, a table border or an image border. It allows you to turn on and off the border. Now from here, this one works a little bit differently. This takes in a yes value or a no value. So if it's on, it has that gray sculpted border. And if it's off, it basically puts 5 pixels of space in there and it has no visible border with a color. So frame border just turns on and off. Now here you can see these don't actually look drastically different, but you can see that this one has more of a border. You see how it's a little bit thicker, you have a little bit of shading there, whereas this right here is just 5 pixels of space in between. So notice that we can have no border or a border, and that's kind of visually what it will look like in your browser. It may differ by browser, but that's the general idea. Now here's an example of what it might look like in code. Notice that we don't have a pixel width or anything in here. So you don't put 0 and you don't put 5. You put yes or no when it comes to frame border. So remember those 2 options when you start coding, that your browser is able to interpret and read what you're asking it to do. Now border color kind of does just what you expect it to do. It indicates the color of your frame borders. And something to note is that the default color is gray. So here you can either use the color name, or you can experiment with the hexadecimal coloring that we've talked about in the past if you want something a little bit more exact and you know what its color representation number is. So then if you look here, you can see the color differences, the default of gray versus the non-default of navy blue being added in there. So a couple more attributes to go. Border, as you would expect, now that we've talked about border color and frame border on and off, indicates the thickness of that border line. And the thickness is done in pixels, just like it's been done with our table border or our image borders before. So margin width and margin height are two more attributes that work as expected. They adjust the left and right margin, so that's the width, that's the left and right margins, and you can basically change the pixels there. So the default is 8 pixels, but you can change that. And then the height does the above or below pixels, so how many pixels you want on either side vertically. So you can change that just to kind of add in some spacing or to eliminate some spacing if you choose. That's the purpose of those two attributes. Scrolling is another one, just like frame border, that allows you to turn on and off the appearance of scroll bars. So by default, those scroll bars will appear, and the key is when needed. If you don't need scroll bars, they're not going to appear, but by default, they will appear when needed. If you don't want them to appear, then you need to actually put that no in between scrolling to tell it to not add them in. So you can say yes or no to scrolling for those scroll bars to appear or not. And then if you choose for them not to appear, you essentially will not be able to scroll if for some reason whatever is being displayed within that frame extends outside of the bounds of the frame. So note here that we have a frame with no scroll bars. There's no scroll bar appearing here or at the bottom. However, here we have a frame with a scroll bar, so we have a vertical one as well as a horizontal one to allow us to scroll and view that entire frame and what's being displayed inside of that frame. And again, just an example in code, you put it as an attribute inside of the frame tag. Now something that's kind of cool, and I will show you this as we actually dive into lesson 3 and start coding this, but by default, you can actually resize the frames once you're viewing it in the browser window. So unless you specify that you don't want the person viewing your web page to be able to resize the frame, they can actually click and make it as large or as small as they would like. So you can actually turn that function on and off, and I'll show you how to do that. But essentially, if you want to ensure that your page displays exactly as you created it, you can prohibit the resizing of a frame by using this next attribute. So in order to restrict the ability to resize the frame, you put something called no resize into your frame tag. Now what's kind of unique about this one is that you don't assign this an attribute value. So you do not write like no resize equals and you put something in the middle. That is not what you do here. You simply just write the words no resize, and your browser will know to not allow the person viewing your frame definition file to resize the different frames. So remember, by default, they can be resized whenever the user wants, but we can restrict it so that it does not resize. Something to note, however, is if they do resize the page, if they refresh their browser, it's going to go back to those default settings. So again, as I stated on the previous slide, notice that there's no equal to for these. You just type the word no resize, and that will restrict the user's ability to resize the different frames. And we'll see that in action as we start our coding of frames in lesson 3. So as I stated in the previous lesson, frames really take planning, and you really have to focus on laying out those frames and thinking them through before you actually dive in and code them. So we're going to just discuss this in a little more detail today, now that we know some of those frame attributes. And your goal by the end of today is that you'll be able to code a browser window to display different frames, and you'll be able to really specify what the attributes of those frames should be. So, some key steps that we should be taking every single time that we are coding with frames. 1, you need to sketch out that frame structure on paper first. So just like you need to sketch out your table and just like you need to kind of outline your image map, you need to actually sketch it out and get a visual image of what's going to take place. this step will save you time later because you won't have to guess and check how you're putting those frames together. You'll actually have a solid understanding of how you are formatting and designing and tying those frame set and frame tags together. Another benefit of taking the time to plan is that you'll really be able to clearly see the number of rows and columns if you sketch it out, because they'll just pop out. Visually, you'll see exactly what's going on. And then from there, just from viewing it, you can start to indicate, okay, inside of this frame tag, I will need scrolling. Inside of this frame tag, I will need this margin height. Inside of this frame tag, I'll need no resize, etc., etc. So really sit down, sketch it out, and make notes for each of the different frames that you will be coding. So yesterday we started writing the code for a frame definition file that would really display the image that you see on the screen. So here you see that we have our window in our browser. We have two different columns, so I can do column 1 and column 2. And then within the first column, we've broken it up into row 1 and row 2. So we can clearly see that first we split it into 2 columns, and then second we split that first column into 2 rows. We can now visually see that just from simply sketching out what our frame on our web window needs to look like. Now I recognize that we've only really looked at one frame breakdown so far, but I want you to take note that these frame layouts can occur in a variety of ways. You could have, just 2. You could have 4. You could have 3, but broken apart in a different way. So noticing that there's a lot of different ways to organize with frames. Now keep in mind that the purpose and goals of using frames is to make a layout that is very appropriate. So you have to think about the needs of your website, think about what you want displayed and why, and what makes the most sense visually. A couple of things that you want to consider are the number of items that you want displayed, and then thinking about what will need to be permanent on the screen and what will need to change. So really thinking through which of those frames will always stay constant and which of those frames will change depending on what's happening on the rest of that frame layout. So over the next few slides, I'm going to show you some code for different frame layouts. We're going to talk through what's actually happening within that code. So here, if I zoom out just a little bit, you can see that this would be a good frame definition file set of code. Now here, the first thing you notice is that it comes in and it breaks it apart into 2 columns. So you can see that this break right here breaks it up into 2 columns. Then right below it is where you would start coding for column 1. But what you'll notice about column 1 is that column 1 gets broken up into 2 rows. And then from there you can see, okay, this is column 1, row 1, column 1, row 2. And then within there you'll notice that each of those frame tags has a source. They each have a name. So you know what's going to be displayed and you know what the target name should be should you need to change it. And then they have a title for their purpose. And then you'll notice that that first one has no scrolling involved. Now we're done with column 1 and we look, and what should be coded next is column 2. And we'll notice here that column 2 is just one frame. So it's one big frame, and again it has a name, a source, and a title. Now we can see here that this directly matches what we would expect. We have our 3 different frames, we have 2 columns, and then we have the first column broken up into 2 rows, and then we anticipate, based on the code that we saw in front of us, that this window up here, this frame, will have no scrolling simply based on the attributes that we gave it. So now here we have something similar but slightly different, and this is more of a 4-frame structure. So you'll notice now here we look at our code and we'll notice that right away we broke our entire window up into 2 rows. So the first thing we're coding here is we're coding row 1, and essentially what we did was we took row 1 and we broke row 1 into 2 columns. So this is where frame set tags are different than table tags. We can break this up by rows or columns however we choose. So we've broke this one up into 2 rows. So we have row 1, and then we have row 2. And then we took each of those rows and we broke them up into 2 columns. So here we have row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2. Here's row 2, column 1, row 2, column 2. So you should be able to see that breakdown, and you now should be able to hopefully start coding these as well. You can see how every break we have breaks either a row or a column up further and further and further, and then we end and we have the exact number of frame tags that we need displayed frame-wise on the screen. So what you'll see on the next slide is that we're going to have a window that has 4 different frames. And here you see it. So you know just from looking at the previous slide that we started by breaking this up into 2 rows. So we have row 1 and row 2. And then we took each row and we broke it up into column 1, column 2, column 1, column 2. So here you can clearly see we have the 4 different frames being displayed on the screen. And then we can specify their source, their name, etc., etc. So as I've stated many times, creating a frame layout with rows and columns involves very careful placement of those frame set tags. You have to really think about it slowly. The columns do not need to be the same width. However, by making the widths of those columns the same, you kind of maintain that straight border. So, for example, what I mean by this is you don't have to have, so if you have 2 columns, you don't have to have things that are the same. So you could have something like that if you wished. However, that looks a little bit silly. So just kind of keeping that in mind by keeping some consistency and having them all be the same, that makes your web page look a little bit nicer most of the time. All right, so at this point you are ready to be done with lesson 2, so you can move on to the assignment where you'll finally get the opportunity to practice coding frame definition files and breaking them apart using the frame set tags and the frame tags to define the different frames you want displayed on the screen.